It has been described as Bannon's Bible. The Fourth Turning, published in 1997, describes Anglo-American civilization as going through a series of four main generational phases, cycling from founding, awakening, unraveling, and crisis. The authors describe a trend going back centuries throughout much of Western civilization, essentially seeing a pattern of birth, rise, decline, and fiery death, whose ashes enrich the soil for a rebirth. It's an old idea, having much in common with ancient myths mirroring seasonal patterns to life. But what is perhaps new in America is that the establishment, for the first time in a long while, feels as if people like Steve Bannon are aware that the United States is in terminal decline, and bringing about that crisis may in fact hold the keys to its rebirth. However, in doing so, may unravel the very power structure that the establishment currently dominates.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostage.
It's been time to give it.
На полный разгон гунусских захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. I'm Hans Lander. Today, we're here to discuss a very particular model of American history. This model and this book that it comes from made a lot of waves in the American mainstream press, WAPO, New York Times, Associated Press, The Atlantic, and so on, in their various exposés on the infamous chief strategist of the Trump administration, head of Breitbart News, and CEO of the Trump campaign, Steve Bannon. Now, this book, of course, is The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe and William Strauss. The book was always sort of pitched as the Bannon Bible. It was pitched as a very dark, very grim, apocalyptic even, and that there were many accusations that Bannon was trying to himself, in his mind, bring about an apocalypse or something to that effect. It was very, very strange pathologizing of him on a book that is, as we'll get into, not really that dark and not really that apocalyptic. Joining me to talk about this book today, we have Adam Smith.
Hey, everyone.
Nick Mason.
Hey, and I just wanted to thank we had a new donor, first initial D, for $15 on our Patreon, and very much appreciated.
Great. Hank Oslo.
Hey, everyone.
And returning to the podcast, we have Alexei Nicholsonsky. How's it going, Alexei?
It's very good. Glad to be back.
You've finally escaped Kevin Spacey's basement, have you, Alex?
I don't want to talk about it.
Hashtag me too, for everyone concerned.
Great.
Alex was training at the League of the Shadows. He was preparing for the future. So we're going to draw on his strength as we go forward.
The future is here. Yeah. Let's talk about this damn book.
So this is an introduction to an ongoing series we'll have running, I think, a Theories of History series that we'll have episodes on. This book is a very interesting set of theories. Although I'll say right off the bat, and I think everyone agrees, it's sort of muddied as a book and overly verbose and not always very clear in the specifics of the model or how the model will play out.
Did you just pick it out because Bannon was kind of a fan?
Yeah. Well, it was more, I was curious what it is about this book that is freaking out your average shitlib journalist on the west or east coast. I assume that at least some of them read it, or at least their editors read it and then gave them talking points on it. And they all seemed to pitch it as apocalyptic, grim, dark, overly, I don't know, almost overly complex. They always seem to try and paint it as this super complex academic work that Bannon poured over and believed in like it was dogma.
Didn't they call it his, like Bannon's Bible?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of ridiculous because from what we know about Bannon, he apparently reads everything.
Yeah.
So how much
has he ever commented on this?
Yes. So Bannon made a film called Generation Zero, I think in 2010. And in the film, it's sort of a documentary about, to an extent, the Tea Party movement coming up and the after effects of the financial crisis and the election of Obama and then the introduction of Obamacare and things like that. He pitches this idea throughout, although not too directly, of the fourth turning, or the turning theory of history. The turning theory of history is supposedly a cyclical theory of history that you could apply to any civilization. But in this specific case, it more easily fits what the authors describe as Anglo-American civilization, going back to the late medieval period and the what is
I
it?
think the War of the Roses is the first episode.
Yeah. The retreat from France is the Unraveling, where this starts, and then the War of the Roses, as England starts to come out of this huge long conflict they've had with the French, and then immediately after the Tudor Renaissance starts, and that's where a lot of the ideas, the Anglo ideas that would eventually inform American political philosophy come from, is the late 15th century and early 16th century, right before.
Should we try to describe the wheel model?
Yes. So the wheel, it's not a total wheel model. It's not as if that you're eternally locked in this. There is an implicit element of, I think, what we would call Whigist history that they take into account. I mean, they're both Ivy League guys. Howe is Yale and Strauss is Harvard. So their model of American history is still sort of the progressive model. They augment it by demonstrating that there are cycles within it, although the trend is always progressively moving forward. Every 20 years.
Contrary to, like, if you take older theories of cyclical theories of history, like you have in the ancient world, or in the case of Vico, or closer to modern times, Oswald Spengler, these are dealing with much larger time cycles. They're, it's looking for laws in history and ages of history and certain things that correspond to these ages, whereas this is a much tighter generational model. These are generational cycles rather than big historical epochs.
Yeah, they do spend an awful lot of time talking about those various. They're basically pagan. Cyclical theory of history is a pagan
Etruscan
concept, I think.
in particular is when they comment on the Etruscan and Roman sort of.
There's no question they're influenced by it. They're applying it in a tight, very American way.
Yeah. It's a what do they call it? A saeculum, something like that. What's the term? They have this idea that.
Is that related to secular? Years, right? It's spelled very similarly.
It's related to the Novus Ordo Seclorum. I think it's the same seclorum root.
Yeah, so seculum.
Secular is in the sense of not religious. It's an age or a unit of time.
They were using it in the sort of sense that the new emperor would have like his own age. I think that was the word they used. It was kind of redefining, what Rome was about. It was a Roman
the new. It's like a civic regime. Like every 80 to 100 years, effectively, a new civic regime of some kind comes in, it matures, it starts to unwind or decay, and then it collapses, and then a new one comes up. Maybe not necessarily the lifespan of an emperor, but the lifespan that civic regimes typically have. In this case, they were applying it to Roman history, and then they're also then applying it to Anglo-American history. So partially in England, and then partially in the United States, because they go back to late medieval England too.
So they seem to have a very kind of imperial viewpoint. Like there has to be kind of this grand civilization that they look to, these big patterns happening. Did they do much with Asia at all?
Yeah.
They're so vague that it's hard to really know. I mean, the book is intentionally vague and intentionally just padded with filler so that it can be filled up and so that it can be adapted to anything that happens, I think.
I kind of agree, but just to be more clear, why did you think it was vague? I mean, they gave a lot of examples, but are you looking for more of like a concrete like model, or what?
I mean, if we're going to be talking, if we're talking about a cycle, I think that a cycle should go by the actual definition of something that's cyclical, such as seasonality in time series data. The weather is cyclical. What else is cyclical? Geysers are cyclical.
If they had a chart, would you be more willing to believe them, or what do you
There
think
are tables and
I
like
want something that could be validated. I mean, it's basically just silly to think that the United States is a stationary process that has been, unfolding many times so that over this apparent cycle, so that we can sort of confirm that the cycle is actually happening. I mean, basically what they do is they have four. They have a circle divided into four quadrants, and these four quadrants line up with the greatest generation, the hippie generation, kind of Gen X, and the millennial generation. So they just took what was on the table in 1997 when the book was written and created a little story to sort of fit that.
They
in my
also
opinion,
incorporate the much older, which I'm not very familiar with, but the much older generations going back to even the founding of the United States, and then they go into Europe. And at that point, like I'm with you. I'm just trying to understand what actually would convince you of something. I mean, it's very difficult to take all of history and just say, oh, there's this like equation that runs everything. I mean, who the hell is going to be able to figure that out? It is silly, but
history doesn't, in my opinion, history is not cyclical. So, I don't know what it would take to convince me. I guess history would have to be different.
I do think things do move, because I think people learn from experiences and then they kind of repeat mistakes, because you probably have all seen that chart about, strong men create, good times create weak men create bad times create, I forget, but it's like a four cycle thing. And so it's very reminiscent. And then there's also the Thomas Cole arc of civilization, where you have like a pastoral phase, then a agricultural phase, and a civilization or empire phase, and then there's kind of like a decline phase. You can all look that up, Thomas Cole civilization, and there's these magnificent pieces of artwork that portray these four seasonal cycles. And I agree, it's not some kind of like railroad track that doesn't deviate in the slightest and everything is predetermined. But it seems to be an old theme, and it's kind of interesting that it keeps coming up. And I wonder if it's just a coincidence that...
astrology is popular too.
Yeah, I get it. But I guess what I'm trying to challenge you on is, how is this any different than anything else in terms of people's attempts to understand the world, which is incredibly complex? I mean, I would say religion is an attempt to understand our surroundings. I would say science is an attempt to understand our surroundings. And we always make mistakes. But what is the most objective way to compare what is good from what is not good? And it's a hard question. I'm not saying I have a perfect answer, but I would say if you're going to say this is bad, at least say, well, this is better and this is why.
It's not useful. I just don't know how to use it. I mean, I see civilizations that last 1,000 years, and they get bumped around and they have trouble, but there's no apparent cycle in many of these civilizations. Or if there is a cycle, it's so irregular that it's really not cyclical. It's just random shit happens, and you bounce back or you don't bounce back from it.
It would be difficult to apply this to the Chinese or even pre-Arab Egypt, or even pre-Greek, pre-Alexandrian Egypt. Yeah.
Well, but there is some sense that there can be things that look like cycles in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Chinese have this saying. I put it in the notes. The saying is roughly like a kingdom that falls apart comes together, and a kingdom that comes together falls apart. And I think that's probably, well, it's obviously due to the nature of Chinese history, where you always have periods of civil war, and then a strong empire comes back together, more or less on the same territory of like classical Han China.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that probably what's going on there is you have a geographical sort of incentive or a geographical constraints in such a way that China is kind of a natural kingdom. So when it inevitably breaks apart because, barbarian invasions happen, you hit Malthusian limits and the people revolt. People in general just seem to go crazy when they hit a Malthusian limit and kill. You have a civil war. Like that's kind of what was happening.
See, here's
in Rwanda.
a perfect case where there is, somebody who attempted to model people's population growth hitting a limit. Malthus and many others have done that. But you seem to think that is a more accurate model.
Yes, because that can be valid.
In any unbounded time frame, you could probably say, yeah, sure, and eventually anything will fit within it. But is that more useful to you than this?
Yes, because we can. I mean, the model presented in A Farewell to Alms that we did an episode on a while back.
Uh-huh.
The model there can be validated because it's not actually saying that much, and we can use old records, church registry records to show that, when basically England in the medieval period moved along a curve of income per person and population, and it would just kind of go back and forth along this curve.
Okay.
So you have more people, income goes down. Fewer people, income goes up. Very simple sort of thing that it's I think I made my point.
The less complex the model, the more sense it makes. Like this is a very complex model.
And I don't want to hammer it too much. I mean, it is a useful. I'm glad I read the book, and it is really useful to think about generations, particularly I think in a mass society environment where you have real marked differences between generations. Like in the old days, the reason that you looked up to your elders was because the environment was stable and your elders had knowledge that was useful for that environment, right? And now you look down on your elders because they don't have a freaking clue what is going on.
Right.
I do think it makes sense when there is kind of this generational lag and people, if their parents had a hard time, they're typically going to have those lessons taught to them. But if they have an easier time than their parents, they're probably not going to be able to impart those same lessons to their children. And so there's this kind of like, you can even look at it like as kind of like a wave pattern where there's kind of like vigilance, high amounts of vigilance, then it creates this, again, like it creates a very robust society. And then it's so robust that people are really kind of questioning, well, why am I so vigilant all the time? I can just relax more. And then that suddenly creates more complacency, and then you have this problem and it bottoms out, and then everything kind of has to reform and go the other way. But whether it's 4 quadrants, I don't know. I think I can just sort of see it as a wave. Things go
it's
up and
echoing
down.
So just to state for the record, like, yes, the perennialist, traditionalist, capital T view, it's not a scientific worldview. It's much more of a metaphysical approach to history, and it obviously cannot be. That starts from the premise of the golden age, right? And you have various descending ages corresponding to the sort of classes of man. The priest class, the warrior class, the merchant class, and the slave class. Mm-hmm. And by the time you get to the bottom, you reach the nadir, and you have the golden age will return again. This is an old way of looking at the world and history, and it's popped up in various cultures and civilizations. And here you have.
Is that what this is?
Say what?
Is that what this is? That sounds
Well, it's
little
influenced this. So you have the use of 4 is significant in that sense, just like with seasons. I mean, you see it opens with winter is coming, something to that effect, and that's what Spangler called the Faustian winter. And here you have, so reading from the book, a society enters a turning once every 20 years or so, when all living generations begin to enter their next phases of life. Like archetypes and constellations, turnings come forward to this is that word again, saeculum, and always in that same order. The first turning is a high. Old prophets disappear, nomads enter elderhood, heroes enter midlife, artists enter young adulthood, and a new generation of prophets is born. The second turning is an awakening. Old nomads disappear, heroes enter elderhood, artists enter midlife, prophets enter young adulthood, and a new generation of child nomads is born. The third turning is an unraveling. Old heroes disappear, artists enter elderhood, prophets enter midlife, nomads enter young childhood, adulthood, and a new generation of child heroes is born. The fourth turning is a crisis. Old artists disappear, prophets enter elderhood, nomads enter midlife, heroes enter young adulthood, and a new generation of child artists is born.
And very, very quickly, so we have high, awakening, unraveling, crisis, and what they say is that the 50s, the golden age 50s was a high, and then the 60s through the early 80s was an awakening. Unraveling was roughly mid 80s to 2008, and then now we're in a crisis.
Right, and to just condense what I was saying earlier is contrasting this with these older perennial theories of history. It's a truncated view. It's happening on these much shorter generational time horizon, whereas in Spangler you had much longer time horizons, and then if you go back to like Aryan India, you have things unfolding on thousands of year time frames.
The Kali Yuga is like 10,000 years, right?
Right. It's a kalpa, I believe, is 10,000 years. I could be wrong about that, but yeah. This is taking those kind of rhythms and applying that to America.
It's a very specifically Anglo-American theory. Like, and they admit as much. I see it as a good companion to Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher. Like in Albion Seed, there is a lot more.
Isn't that more HBD though?
Yeah, that's more HBD. That's more genealogical. But
it's an ethnohistory.
It's an ethnohistory, but there's a certain element of the genealogy determines the political philosophy and the culture, right?
Yeah, but those things don't change.
No doubt.
Whereas this is more universal, it seems, and also.
Well, Hans is right. It is applying to. I mean, it is. They specifically name Anglo-American society.
They don't spend time on any other civilization as much as they do the Anglo-American civilization. That is like their focus. Really. Yeah. So, I that's how when I was reading it, I was like, this is a really good companion to Albion Seed, or maybe to even Tocqueville's War in the United States, where you have a general kind of lofty historical theory, and that there's more serious work that's been done to actually validate parts of it. So validating the idea that Anglo-American civilization really gets started in the late medieval era, in the Tudor Renaissance, back in England. That's something
maybe you
that
can
you need.
Give
You need Albion Seed,
or the book's definition of what that means. Anglo-American civilization.
Well, Anglo-American civilization is effectively the civilization of the English people. So defined really as everything to the east of the Welsh, and the south of the Scots and the Picts in the north. A group of people who had their king replaced by the Norman French, and then throughout the Norman French, and then we're just sort of not very distinguishable from many other groups in Europe for a long time.
Except for the Lindisfarne Gospels.
Yeah, like there's a few things that distinguish pre-Tudor England from maybe the Holy Roman Empire, but there isn't really much. Like they're essentially just Germans.
Anglo-Saxon England was basically a little Renaissance in the Dark Ages.
Yeah,
but that ends in 1066, of course.
Right, that ends in 1066 when the Normans take over, and then
William the Conqueror.
Yeah, but then, even then, like they are not distinguished that much, and the Normans, I think we've kind of established this again back in the Farewell to Alms episode. The Normans didn't really have much an effect on English genealogy or English, not too much on English culture. There's essentially just this ethnic group that's divided itself into various kingdoms, Kent, Sussex, or Essex, and so on. And they don't really do anything spectacular until they have a series of wars with the French. They invade France. They start to conquer other parts of the British Isles. I think even before the 17th century, there were still parts of the British Isles that the English didn't fully control. And once they threw out the French, and then they eventually retreated from their wars in France, that final crisis, the War of the Roses, which is a civil war effectively inside of England, ends, and there's a reconsolidation of the English monarchy. After that, you have this high period. This is the first high period that we see in this model, and that is the Tudor Renaissance, which goes from 1487 to 1517. So these high periods are defined by sophistication in terms of technological growth, in terms of cultural growth, in terms of theological growth, but they're also defined by simplicity in terms of lifestyle. So people are very simple, they're very traditional, they're focused more on doing big public works, big civilization-defining achievements that are not, I guess, ridiculous. Ridiculous meaning like something that you see later on in these awakening periods that show serious signs of decay in cultural growth. And not long after that, you have the Protestant Reformation, which takes over, let's say, all of Northern Europe for the most part. And we talked about this actually on the Protestant Reformation in retrospect episode, that the English had sort of a complex history, King Henry, with the Reformation, but ultimately abided by it and then formed the Anglican Church. From that point on, you have the creation effectively of the Puritans. This is the beginnings of the Puritans, and this is really where the beginnings of the Anglo-American civilization come. This is a very well-established, I guess, NRX theory, is that Anglo-American civilization is effectively Puritan civilization.
Well, they were one of the founding groups, so you could make that very seemingly reasonable claim without too much controversy. Yeah. I would expect.
The Puritans were rooted out in England, after the English Civil War, but in America they've kind of continued to run rampant in various ever more heretical forms.
See, that's where I would say it's debatable. I mean, in the beginning, the institutions that were created, I would certainly agree that the Puritans and the people in Massachusetts had a huge role. Today, just in terms of sheer numbers, they're just so much smaller, and in terms of influence, they are.
Yeah, but the idea is that Puritanism informed the Yankee mindset, and
Elizabeth Warren is a Puritan.
Sure,
right?
Yes.
The following, like, these institutions were built in that form. So even as the WASPs are sort of being nudged out, you still have the old trappings remain. The old moralism and the old, as H.L. Mencken said, the old, creeping fear that someone somewhere might be having fun.
Right. I can't remember who wrote this, but it was an article that basically compared the kind of liberal women to church ladies of days of yore.
Yeah.
Jim Goad. The new church ladies. That's him, right?
Jim Goad?
I think so.
He's definitely channeling Mencken. I mean, that was Mencken's thrust.
Both
of
him and
his
Jack Donovan
vitriol.
have cited church ladies, and they're not sure who recoined it.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, I mean that culture still exists. It's basically kind of, you can call it purity spiraling, holier than thou, whatever. It's kind of this, like, people need to feel guilty for doing well. And
Well, keep in mind the sort of like the thing with Puritans is their own salvation is contingent upon the salvation of others, which is why they're always in your business. But of course, now you have a sort of an apostate Puritanism, which is where it gets very strange.
So Hans, continue, please.
So before I go any further, I want to comment on the seculum cycle. So we mentioned that there's 4 turnings to a seculum. Seculums go from, what is it, Alex, like 80 to 100 years, give or take? It's not.
Yeah, they've said that you basically have a pretty good chance of seeing a seculum in a given lifetime.
Right. So there's been 7. We are in the 7th currently. The late medieval seculum, which to their minds only has a 3rd turning and a 4th turning. Because again, there's no distinguishable really Anglo and then, I guess American civilization prior to the 3rd turning retreat from France. The Reformation seculum, the New World seculum, which we'll get into in a sec. The Revolutionary seculum, the Civil War seculum, the Great Power seculum, and the Millennial seculum. So it's in the towards the end of the New World seculum and then the very beginning of the Revolutionary seculum, where they note you have the Awakener generation, the 11th generation of Anglo-American civilization. Yeah, the 11th generation of Anglo-American people. They are the first truly American, quote-unquote, generation for a litany of reasons, mostly distinguishable, everything from distinguishable surnames to distinguishable political philosophy differences with their kin back in England. When the Reformation finishes and you have the Puritans starting to try and gain power, and you have Cromwell and all these things propping up, right before that you have, I guess, the Armada Crisis, which is actually a very short crisis period. It's only, actually, I'm sorry, it's not short. I misread that, but it's from 1569 to 1594. This is the Spanish Armada. This is the make or break moment for post-Reformation England. This is pre-British Empire. The English don't really have much of an empire at this point. They don't even have total control over the British Isles, including Ireland. And they are faced with the potential Spanish, or I guess Pope-sanctioned invasion of England. The Spanish Empire at that point is effectively what the British Empire would become. The Spanish were the leading global group at the time, the Spanish Kingdom. And in a twist of fate, the Spanish Armada is destroyed. What was it, by like a freak storm? I'm trying to remember my history, like the Great Wind or something that the English used to call it.
I think it was English steel and cannons.
Really? Okay.
Bravery.
Was it Trafalgar, or I mixed these up?
No, Trafalgar, that's Napoleonic, but there was a mix. There was a mix of, like, there was a storm.
Sir Francis Drake, right?
Yeah,
Well,
there was
who knows?
There was a storm period where I think a lot of the Spanish Armada suffered, and then the English.
I think there was a storm, but I also do remember watching this documentary, God knows how long ago. But it was basically all the Spanish ships were these giant fortresses on the water, and they had all these cannons loaded down, and they couldn't maneuver. And so it was the British ships, which were much smaller, who were nimble, and they were kind of maneuvering around them. So I think there was a lot of tact in the battle that brought the favor to the side of the British. But I do seem to also remember there was some inclement weather that didn't help the Spanish either.
Yeah. So the point is the destruction of the Spanish fleet was a huge catastrophic loss to the sort of embarrassment to the papacy, to the Spanish Empire, and to continental Europe in general. Right after that, you have the beginning of the New World Seculum, and the high period is Merry England. And this is when the English start kicking out their church ladies to the United States, or to America. And this is the founding of Jamestown.
And the not so church going people to Australia.
That comes a little later, and they start throwing the convicts down to Aussie.
Yeah.
But yes, the English have this habit of, especially post-Reformation, of just, I think Hank said this once, they used to execute like maybe 1% of their population every year, and then those they didn't execute, they kicked out.
Wow, it's like Microsoft Corporation.
This sort of bred a docile population.
That's a thing, and I think Jack Welch popularized it, but it was basically GE was the first company to make this famous, where they would take whatever percent, I think it was like 1% every year, and just fire them, and all the managers had to do this culling process every quarter or every year, where they'd have to find the quote-unquote underperformer. And a lot of the guys were like, well, I'm happy with my team. I don't want to get rid of anybody. And like, no, you have to. There's always going to be somebody who's worse, or the worst. And it just, God, when they put that at Microsoft, people were just really unhappy. A little bit of a tangent, but I can imagine it can only be worse if that was actually you're executed every year. And how much of a politicization of the culture that creates, because everybody has to suck up and make sure they're not on the shit list, and that's pretty rough.
I don't think it wasn't a defined 1%. It was just like, oh, you got caught stealing a horse, death. You got caught.
So it was just law of averages. It came out at about 1% annually.
This is really the medieval period. It's a little bit before the period we're talking about. I think after you get to this sort of period, 1500s, 1600s, the English are pretty well domesticated.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, certainly they're still hanging people all the time, but maybe it wasn't quite 1% that it was in 1200.
I think that was perhaps the peak. I'm sure, well, I don't know. They weren't shy about executing people. The magnitude is open to speculations, so I don't have those numbers in front of me, but they weren't gun shy.
So right after you have the Puritans showing up in early America and establishing some of these colonies, you have another awakening period. So you have the Puritan awakening, and this is sort of the philosophical basis for Puritanism in the United States. So seeing America as their promised land, seeing an opportunity to recreate English civilization in a way that they think failed at some kind of unclear point. Specifically, not having monarchy, not having royalty inside the United States was a particular sticking point for these people. So you'll notice that I don't think at any point any royal visited America. I'm almost pretty sure on that theory that for the most part, this area was regarded as a backwater, but it was also that the people there were just not very kind to royalty to begin with.
And also keep in mind, it's like a 2-month round trip minimum.
Right.
Pretty dangerous too.
Yeah.
So this period of American history is actually not that bad, although you do see some unraveling, and then you have the Glorious Revolution, which is more focused back in England. You have some squabbles inside the United States, or the early United States, but there's more problems back in Old England between people and various nobles and the monarchs and the monarch and so on.
That was about getting a Protestant back on the throne.
Yes, with
the Dutchman.
William of Orange, correct?
Yeah.
So right after this, you have the Augustan age of empire, the beginning of the revolutionary secular. So as you can tell by the name revolutionary secular, this is the period wherein the United States officially rebels against the British Empire. This first generation of like truly American people is, as they Howe and Strauss call them, produces most of the revolutionary leaders. I think it's really this period between 1727 and 1746, and slightly before that, you see the births of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, and so on. Some of them are more, shall we say, pro-royal than others. Certainly, George Washington and his family back in England were much more pro-royal than Thomas Paine or Patrick Henry or Jefferson, who all had elite ties and all had, and probably financial ties to the English government or the English crown. But some were obviously kind of Freemasonic radicals, shall we say, particularly Henry and Paine, and to an extent Jefferson. Those were the most hardcore anti-royalists. Those are guys who would have gladly shot King George if given the chance. This like weird period where these people are starting to think, well, we can have self-rule, we're self-sufficient here, we have a good economy going, we're able to handle the French. One of the big sticking points is too with the French and Indian Wars is that the English colonists felt they weren't given enough support by the British Crown to fight the French and the Indians, and were made to fend for themselves in a lot of cases, and won. And sometimes had to resort to ethnic cleansing to get rid of the French or get rid of unfavorable tribes.
Wasn't that portrayed in Last of the Mohicans?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, The Last of the Mohicans pitches it as mostly just British redcoats, but the reality was that it was in large part a lot of just militiamen, like the same type of revolution you see in the American Revolution. You just have farmers picking up rifles or muskets and shooting redcoats. It was essentially just farmers going and shooting French grenadiers. Like there was no real distinguishable difference. The largest sticking point between even people like George Washington and the Crown was he didn't help us enough when we needed your help, when we were facing extermination. So why would we want to stay with you to, in our minds, solve this ourselves? Revolution happens. They say 73 to 94 is really this huge crisis period. 1776 is sort of the peak when it just explodes in violence across the country. You have open rebellion. After they won the revolution, you have the era of good feelings. This is where the model's kind of weird, because this is supposed to be a high, and in their models, the high period has very little violence, almost no violence, no war. This period goes from 1794 to 1822. The problem is we have the War of 1812 in this period. War of 1812 could also have been defined as a crisis for the United States, in my mind.
The White House did get burned to the ground,
the White House was burned to the ground. You had invasions from the South, which is where Andrew Jackson.
I think
down in Louisiana.
The war extended up to Canada as well. It was it was pretty significant.
Yeah, the burning of DC was actually a retaliation for the U.S. Burning Ottawa, or I believe Ottawa.
Well, whatever the capital was, Ottawa is not in a very commercially advantageous location because of that war. They actually moved it away from the border. So maybe it was the precursor to what Ottawa is today, which is the capital.
Following the revolution, a lot of loyalists fled to Canada.
Yeah. That's
you also had several disputed elections in the U.S. In that time frame. The election of 1800 with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. You had the subsequent election of Andrew Jackson, it was not tremendously politically stable.
Yeah. Well, they call this the era of good feelings, but I don't know if that's supposed to be ironic, but kind of like how they call, Philadelphia, the city of love, even though pretty much everyone in Philly is a huge asshole. Sorry to our Philly listeners, but
there was
Philadelphia literally means brotherly love, so that's why.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. But I just have to imagine, like, after a big war like that, even if you do win, it's got to be a little scary because you're on your own now. And so you're going to have to defend against the British, and I guess the French helped you a little bit, but you really have kind of a broken military. I think the debt that they had incurred was
the country was in ruins.
Yeah.
I mean, John Adams was sailing around the world under orders of Washington to like get credit from the Dutch and the French royalty, and even went to back to England to chat with King George very briefly. Like, the country was broke. There was no formal military. Again, it was farmers who decided to go back to their farms, or people who worked, down at the docks in Boston, or worked as a metalsmith in Philadelphia. These people were not interested in long-term military service or anything like that.
You had that rebellion that Washington had to put down.
Yeah, you had the Whiskey Rebellion. Like, immediately afterwards, it's sort of silly to start calling this the era of good feelings when you just have so much shit going on that it is really bad for the United States and almost destroys it. Like, the War of 1812 almost destroyed the United States. It really did.
Keeping in mind that this is like something of it's almost esoteric boomer historicism, and if you start from the premise of like the boom, the alleged economic boom after World War II, then and you work your way back trying to find those patterns, that's probably where this is coming from.
So it's like post-war boom, in their mind.
Because it centers around this idea, and they actually identify boomers as narcissistic and materialistic.
Yeah, I have to give the book credit in that. I mean, I think culturally it was fairly accurate given how long ago it was written, and how quickly culture can shift on you. I would say they were pretty spot on in defining kind of the malaise of the 90s and kind of what happened after that.
They're really good at raking sort of, like, we'll get into that when we get to the boomers. This is probably, it's funny that it is very much a boomer history, but it does nothing but essentially point to them as the reason for many of our current problems.
Or do they basically just say this is the nature of a cycle and there's nothing you can do about it?
Well, there's the nature of the cycle, but they go out of their way to point out like all the things the boomers are doing, all of the long-term effects that they had specifically on Gen X. Like, the alienation and cynicism of Gen X, they make a point, is a cynicism and alienation that you sometimes see in these cycles that has just never been known to this extent. Like, the damage that boomers inflicted on the culture.
These people, this idea of like blaming the boomers for everything. I mean, the boomers, it was the World War II generation that put through a lot of these, the Warren Court and the disaster of the 1960s. And then you have, you basically have media and education working to traumatize every generation to a greater and greater extent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I agree. Like, boomers in general, as a block of people, are, well, I could say something rude, but what's really going on here is the oligarchy is pushing us in a direction that they want us to go in, and like the boomers are being led along just like our generation.
I agree.
Yeah, I would second that too, Alex, in the sense that I think it's pretty futile to look for organic rhythms in 20th century American history, because so much of 20th century American history is so synthetic. It's
social engineering.
It's the product of social engineering. Exactly.
Well, what country isn't? And I could even argue that this country is less engineered because how chaotic and complex.
Well, it was
and big
exported
it is.
to the rest of the world. I mean, it's this.
I agree. There's a higher degree of engineering today than there ever was, but compared to what? What else? I mean, it's basically compared to itself. And
they're so good at engineering that I think that we're more engineered than, say, Yugoslavs or Romanians, because the communists were terrible at social engineering. All they could do is starve people and make people hate the government. But
sure, it was not very sophisticated in communist countries because they didn't have to be. They had no challenge to their power essentially, other than a mass militarized revolt, and you're not allowed to have a gun in those countries, so it was pretty.
Well, I mean, it only lasted 40 or 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, their Achilles heel was economic, but
they couldn't keep people happy. I mean, our social engineers,
civilization. There's things that happen in history that cause shocks, etc. But in 20th century American history, it's people being led around as Alex is saying, led around by the nose by the oligarchs. I mean, there's a very specific direction to so many. Like when they get into talking about the Cultural Revolution, it seems like they're attributing it, and same with shifting attitudes about immigration, and these things were all foisted upon people. This wasn't like the product of some kind of organic cultural shift.
I totally agree with that. It's just, are we more socially engineered than these other countries is kind of my
or are we more socially engineered now than maybe the revolutionary population? So there's a huge swath of people that participated in the revolution.
It's tough to compare apples to oranges in some ways because the information technology and the media just didn't exist back then. But they're very ignorant, and so they had, we could be ignorant in having too much false information, but it's like they had so little information about compared to what we have. There
was no technocratic elite class. There was none of this H.G. Wells type approach.
No, but there was an aristocracy, and there was a group that could command your respect almost by just sheer obvious, displays of
you didn't
power
even have
and wealth.
Mass advertising back then, though. The 20th century. These are very new creations of the 20th century, and particularly American society.
Sure.
Imagine the world of Huck Finn. Life is just kind of farming,
Yeah, I think the reality of your town and your family especially is more relevant than it is now. I certainly agree with that. So this kind of central power authority is more distant. But all I was trying to make a point about was that given that they have almost no information, whoever does have the funds to buy a newspaper is going to be really influential. And so compared to today, where anybody can have a blog, I mean, it's kind of interesting. How do you compare generations?
Well, there's a difference between controlling the flow of information and conditioning people's processing of information. Those are two very different things.
Sure.
So if I had to amend this particular part of the model, the American Revolution through the era of good feelings, I would say that you would need to have an abnormally sized fourth turning. The American Revolution would go from 1773 to, let's say, 1816. Because then you're able to cover not just the revolution against the British Empire, you're able to cover the Whiskey Rebellion, some other internal squabbles, and then you're also able to cover the War of 1812, and then you pick up again with your high in after the Louisiana Purchase and the beginnings of the Great American Homesteading Project, beginnings of Manifest Destiny, so on. And I would include also at least part of what they call the Transcendental Awakening, which is this very American philosophy. It's essentially Hegelianism, but it's the American Transcendental School. I would include part of that in there because the early American transcendental philosophy is actually very straightforward, and it's not overly decadent the way that you typically see later on with it and that you see in Awakening philosophical development. But this period after the Era of Good Feelings is essentially the Tocqueville period. I think late 1820s, 1830s is when Tocqueville experiences the United States and is able to give an outsider's perspective on it. And sort of one of the best historical tools we have for analyzing this period. And this is a golden age. Like, this specific period is a golden age. And I would say it is the high. So you have amounts of sort of overlapping social order. This is where Americans become very well known for a lot of private organizations, private book clubs, private lodges, things like that form extra-governmental associations and bonds between people.
Non-government organizations.
Yeah. I mean, some of them are tied to the government, but they are extra-government in a sense that they provide extra bonds for people and they provide extra order for these societies to live in. And then this kind of confidence that you have going on at this time is what kicks off the American communitarian and like proto-communism that we talked about in our episode on communist infiltration. And I would say that would be a better second turning or awakening, because then you start to see the decadence and sort of the ridiculousness that you see in these spiritual awakening periods. And that would then take you into the unraveling, where you have the Yankees in the North, part of the Midwest, dabbling in this sort of ridiculous philosophy. And then the abolitionist movement starts to come from there. And you have a huge divergence in the country, an unraveling between the Northern philosophy and the Southern philosophy, which takes you into, obviously, the Civil War. When the Civil War is complete, and this is a very, very short turning. This is a 5-year turning. It's literally just from the beginning of the Civil War to the end of it, 1860, 1865.
So I would point out that if a turning is not more or less a fixed interval of time, then it's not really a cycle.
Right. I think that they don't know how else to.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think he's basically, or they are describing kind of a cultural shift. And I would say it's not realistic to expect that would happen on a fixed time cycle. I think you could.
So that it's not a cycle. By definition, it's not a cycle.
No. That's why. Why does it have to be?
Because you can have cycles. You can have cycles that have variable length.
Yeah.
Like all it means is that it goes through roughly the same.
Yeah, it's a pattern. It's a pattern, and so there's like kind of an order to it. I would say, there's enough reason and organization to the theory to make it not completely useless. Now, I agree.
If a crisis is always followed by a high, then yeah, okay, then it's like useful in some way, I suppose.
I mean, you could even make it mathematical, where you have kind of like a random, factor in there, but you still have kind of these. The same sequence is kind of recurring, is I think basically the point of the book. And I'm not trying to defend it. I'm just saying in general, like I don't think it has to be every 20 years. There's literally changing of the guard. I think things are too complex for that.
Winter isn't the same every year, but it's pretty much within certain bounds. Winter starts at a certain date, more or less, and it ends at a certain date. That's a cycle, really.
The specific time frame they're working with is roughly 80 years.
80 to 100. Yeah. Well, yeah, for a seculum, yeah. I think that there's an element of like Whiggism here, where they're willing to break their own model, because it's pretty consistent up to this point to fit in the Civil War, because there's nothing that really defines the United States more for your average sort of Ivy League Whig than even today than the Civil War period. It's a huge victory in their eyes, not just on a military front, but on a sort of a cultural assimilation front. And they don't
because it leads to greater liberty and destroys an aristocracy.
Right.
Yeah, it's the great Yankee victory.
Yeah.
Victory of the
There's
Yankee
also
world.
the the raw centralization of power. Like
Yes.
this is a continuing theme that anything that results in more sort of political superstructure being imposed is a positive. And this point, they don't really make it explicit. There's all of this kind of implicit celebration around the United States national government increasing in authority and the prospect of international governance exceeding in authority.
Right. And not long after this period, there are a few Supreme Court decisions, namely that only the federal government can really control immigration. States can no longer control immigration. Birthright citizenship is determined at the federal level. And you also have secession officially made illegal. Like it was, and Southerners will still point this out, up to that point, it was still unclear in the American constitutional context whether or not you could legally secede from the Union. Whereas afterwards, the Yankees made it specifically clear, like, no, you're here forever, no matter what.
Well, technically, Texas is supposed to have an opt-out, right?
They have one in their state constitution, but I don't know if it's recognized federally. That's
Can't
the
you
thing.
leave if you have 2/3 of the Congress to vote for it?
You need a constitutional convention.
Okay.
That's
right.
The specific legalities are almost beside the point because, as we saw, it's a power game.
Right.
It's a might makes right.
You can pass whatever laws or make whatever ex post facto judgments of whether the South metaphysically succeeded in their secession and were reabsorbed versus if they were just in an unsuccessful rebellion the whole time. But none of it really matters. The point is that after the Civil War, it was clear that the central government had enough access to raw power to crush any prospective secessionist movement.
And I should also add that the early secessionist moves, they never obviously were followed through on, but they were actually northern states. I believe Maine was one of them.
Yeah, this was one of the reasons that the War of 1812 was so destabilizing, because it was a war that was basically fought on behalf of New England shipping interests. They wanted essentially to be able to ship their goods to Europe, which was buying everything that wasn't nailed down to fight the Napoleonic Wars. And there was kind of an open question as far as, okay, I mean, that's all well and good, but what exactly is the interest in South Carolina or Georgia or whatever in prosecuting this war so that you can maintain your markets for whale oil or whatever.
Yes, and this brings up
Cotton.
a sort of recurring thing is the superficial aspects of American history, where they try to impart this, if I recall correctly, they're imparting the sort of heroic archetype to people like Teddy Roosevelt. You know, because Teddy, of course, cultivated.
I don't think
this.
that's completely unreasonable of a characterization. I mean, he certainly wanted to be that.
He was a stooge for banking interests, particularly Morgan banking interests.
He also took a Southern wife, like in an attempt to unify, the Yankee Dutch Northern aristocracy and the Southern Belle, or the antebellum South aristocracy, but post Reconstruction.
Yeah, it was a persona he cultivated, like a real heroic, in a bigger historicist frame, a real heroic age and real heroic figures would be ones who are rejecting materialistic values.
You could even argue he was that. I mean, sure, no one is going to
a Morgan man is not rejecting
exactly what you would envision.
Values.
People are different.
He gave
but
us Yellowstone.
yeah, come on. He fought the
gave us-
trust. Maybe this is all some kind of mythos that is created about him, and I'm sure there is some of that. There always is. But find me a president. I mean, you could pick apart any president, okay? You take
Well, that's
George
my point. In
Washington, say he's just
American
doing it
history,
because-
these figures are like America's a mercantile empire. At least that's what it became.
I agree, but my point is there's always sort of a selfish, kind of crass motivation behind every man. No one is. There's no saints. They don't really exist. They're really designed to inspire people to just improve. And nobody's perfect, and nobody's going to meet this this kind of vision of yours. I mean, I could ask you, but I'm afraid what your answer will be, who you envision as being.
You know
heroic,
what my
but,
answer is.
I know, but I mean, is that the only?
Say that there are saints, right? Like,
well, the church designates some, and I think they are reserved for exceptional people, no question. But I do believe there also are just people, and that's just my kind of irreligious point of view, I guess. But all I'm saying is, even a saint is going to have a couple of flaws. Maybe not in the church's eyes, but in my eyes. So
that's
I'm just
not,
saying,
whatever. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
The saints are not like flawless people.
Yeah.
They're just holy people who've.
Okay. Well, then we agree.
So after the Civil War, you get Reconstruction, you get the Gilded Age, which is when things are for the Yankees in the North. Have huge industrialization of New England, and to an extent the upper Midwest and around the Great Lakes region. You have, I guess this is really right after that where you have the Awakening. This is where American progressivism becomes a permanent force in American politics going forward. So this generation is particularly, I think, known as the progressive generation, and they're only really interested in this big sweep of American liberty, Yankee liberty, Yankee liberalism. So you have really the rise of Teddy Roosevelt, and this idea that we're going to become something more than just a union of states. We're going to become a nation. This is when American nationalism takes off. There's a great show by Dan Carlin on this period called American Perils, and it covers this gap period between the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century for the United States, when we're sort of on the cusp of empire. And this is right before we get into our little war with the Spanish down in the Caribbean,
where we really become who we are.
Yes.
And he has that as a second. Is that a second or a third? I see right here. Yes, that would fall under second turning.
Yeah, that's a second turning.
As would the Vietnam War.
Yeah, we'll get to the Nam, but this era before World War I is sort of it's really only interesting because you have, I think, as Alex said, the bison genociders, but you have you have essentially the formation of the modern American ethos around this time, because the nation has, to an extent, recovered enough from the Civil War to start reconstituting a new sort of quasi, or not quasi, but larger than state identity. Who we are as Americans, like that. We're all Anglos, aren't we? Or we're all descended from the same families back in England and the Netherlands and Upper Germany. Even if we just fought a civil war, and these new immigrants, they don't really count. It's us. So we're going to determine the history going forward. World War I and Prohibition is sort of the unraveling. Curious that, again, this is where the model is a little weird. That World War I and Prohibition and also the wars of Spain down in the Caribbean and so on are not its own crisis period. But at this time, you have essentially the Yankees going insane. So first, the Yankees try and conquer the Caribbean from Spain, and then the Yankees try and ban alcohol because the Puritan roots make a big resurgence now that they don't really have any internal opposition within the country, down in the South.
And it helped that all those men were in Europe, not voting.
Yeah, and then then you have the ultimate Yankee.
That was the rise of like the terrible woman archetype.
Yes. This is the women's suffrage period too.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like a confluence of factors. I can only imagine what it's like, Trent, just being an average Joe. You have Yankee industrialists in your government, either sending you off to claim the Caribbean for fruit farming, or to go shoot at Germans in France, or when you come home, you have your wife bitching at you about voting, or when you try and go out to the bar to get a drink because you just fought a war and your wife's bitching at you about voting, the bar gets raided and you get your face smashed by like some federal agent because you had a beer.
When was the draft instituted? Was it Civil War, or I don't think it was always in place though?
They definitely had it in the Civil War.
They had a huge draft in the Civil War.
Right.
A lot of people refused to fight. So Lincoln and his buddies were like importing Irishmen to come.
Yeah, you had the Copperheads in the North.
Yeah.
Down with the Union.
Yeah. What Hank always says this: we won't fight for Abraham's nigger war.
That wasn't me saying that.
I don't think that was just Hank.
that was not my brilliant rhetorical invention. That was some based Irishman, probably.
That was Nick's great grandfather.
Well, Nick, you didn't mention that your ancestors were in the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, okay.
Every cycle, the Masons pop up again to join in the latest rebellion.
Yeah, every cycle they pop up again to troll the Yankees somehow.
It does seem, that there is a bit of a cycle of Puritan excess and then a backlash.
And that they don't ever really mention that. The Puritan angle is, despite being like a book that's supposedly the big expose on American historical trends, Puritans are brought up scantly.
They don't want to offend anyone, because the more people they offend, fewer consulting gigs they can get.
Yes,
and they definitely don't bring up the infusion of alien cultural parasites.
That's true. I don't think the word Jew shows up at any point in the book.
No, I don't think it appears.
Someone do a control F.
I would have noticed.
or race at all, really.
Yeah, the race, and that especially comes of interest when you get to the 60s and applying this model in the 60s. It gets a little cartoonish.
Well, this was written or published at least in 97.
Yeah,
so
that sounds about right. Late 90s. I think
they do acknowledge
probably couldn't get published too easily if you did name that group.
They do acknowledge that racial politics became a forefront issue in the consciousness revolution, the culture wars period in particular, sort of the Gen X period. That was probably one of the preeminent issues was race. I think another one was drug use. But I mean, back to the main point. Effectively, Alex is right. Like that, there really is this Yankee Puritan undertone to the whole thing, and they show up again in this World War I and Prohibition era, and then you have. And
then the 60s is the next time they pop up.
Yeah, the 60s is the next time they pop up, and they kind of replay a lot of the themes that they played in the Transcendental Awakening. The 60s hippie philosophy is essentially just transcendentalism. And then you have...
It's a ratchet. It's a Puritan ratchet. So that there's an excess. They go too far. I mean, you go back a little bit. You take like half a step back.
Yeah.
You never go back to where you were. It's sort of a libertarian idea, but yeah, please continue.
So you have at the end of this, or in the middle part of this period, you have the Wilsonian legacy, right, where America officially becomes sort of a global player. People like to say that somehow, like the United States is isolationist or something up to World War II. That's a very common meme that I think I've seen a lot of Europeans try and talk about.
Which is complete bullshit.
Yeah, which is complete bullshit. Wilson, and we should probably do a show on the Wilsonian legacy, because it's pretty fascinating how utterly fucked we get here.
Well, I think it
We-
was true in the sense that America had never really gone to a European zone of conflict.
That's
The
true.
European, yeah, but the early beginnings of foreign imperialism was the
Right.
Philippines.
Yeah, it was picking up the scraps of a dead empire, but it was not going into the heart of European imperial power.
Well, also opening Japan and China for trade. Like the U.S. had an extremely active foreign policy. They just weren't interested.
The Monroe Doctrine and things like that.
Yeah, until Woodrow Wilson showed up, they weren't tremendously interested in getting involved in gigantic European conflicts. And even more fortunately, in the 1800s, there really weren't that many between the Napoleonic Wars and the end of the Victorian era.
I could see like hardcore Yankees of the Roosevelt type who like violence and like fighting. I mean, the ones that are still around now, particularly, the Yankee boomers are not really into fighting, but these ones I can see really wanting the opportunity more than anyone to go into Europe and flex some muscle because they have the idea of the the glorious United American military that just needs to be tested, tried, and tried in the battlefield.
Well, yeah, I mean, they wanted to send other people's sons to go do this.
That's true.
They had a lot of frontiersmen, and there was this panic about a lack of a frontier.
Yes,
in that era as well, because the frontier had been more or less closed. I mean, look, it was starting to fill up. The country was starting to get populous. It was massively wealthy and industrial. Like they're going to go use that capacity to make war. It's almost inevitable.
And I think that if World War I had not happened on the continent, European continent, that my understanding is that there was very high likelihood that we would have probably invaded Canada.
Yeah.
That the United States was planning for a Canadian invasion prior to that, and was certain the American establishment was sort of shooting for mid 1920s to just officially invade.
That's an interesting counterfactual. Like America invades Canada, and then the Kaiser invades France, and we ally with the Kaiser.
Yeah,
I mean,
the English had huge battle plans for also bringing the Japanese into a counterattack in the 20s and 30s against the United States if we invaded Lower Canada.
Which should be ours anyway.
Yeah.
If you look up the specific U.S. invasion plan for Canada at this time period, it's a pretty funny plan. It's mostly we're going to gas
seize the maple fields.
No, we're going to gas their major population centers, and then they'll be too spread out. We'll just kind of roll in.
With mustard gas?
Terrible. We're gonna kill our the most similar people to us on the planet.
What time period is this?
These plans start coming into effect in the end of the 1910s.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was probably just some jaded lieutenant LARPing, and then immediately getting filed away in some desk drawer.
Well, I mean, that's what those war colleges do all day. They just kind of talk about scenarios. So I'm sure there's a scenario for everything. You saw the ending of War Games. It was like the computer was just cycling through the thousands of possibilities. So I'm sure there's a plan for everything, just about.
Yeah. So, anyways, this period goes all the way up until 1929. So it's a weird period because it encapsulates so much, and this also encapsulates the stock market boom of the 1920s and this huge growth of wealth. It ends in 1929 with the collapse of the stock market and the beginning of the Great Depression. So the third major crisis in specifically American big Anglo-American history sweep is the dual crises period of the Depression and then World War II. Whenever Bannon has talked about the soon-to-be crisis that we're already in, he always says, "Well, we have the Revolution, Civil War, and then we have the Depression, World War II period. This period does a pretty good job of defining the United States. The funny thing is that at no point in this crisis is the U.S. really put at risk. So I don't know what to really say.
I would like to interject something
Okay.
that might be confusing listeners a bit. This isn't, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, Hans, but this is less a model that describes, the ineluctable procession of events so much as it is a model that describes how people see themselves in relation to history and in between the generations, and therefore how they will respond to these events
and their attitudes.
Right.
Their attitudes.
Their personality distribution is
exactly, and because they provide the analogy of the individual's life and how it is that he looks forward to adulthood or looks back on youth, etc. And that's kind of how they see American history functioning, is as these events pop up, as something significant happens, be it the assassination of Kennedy or the Oklahoma City bombing. It's the attitudes of people based on their generational sort of orientation that just help determine what comes next based on their reaction. Is that more or less how this is actually the actual mechanism that they're trying to describe?
Mm-hmm. I mean, their work is mostly in generational. That's their sociological background. So they're using this model to determine like how specific American generations break down, so that marketers can more easily sell them stuff or whatever.
And posing it in sort of this self-psychologizing manner, I think it actually makes their analysis a little bit weaker, because you can have all sorts of cyclical forces based on all kinds of dynamics. Like empires are going to rise and fall just because, Edward Tainter has a really great analysis on this, that basically they kind of expand to fill every ecological niche, and then there's a structural shock to the system, and then they suffer a structural collapse because all the infrastructure that they built for marginal resource extraction is now negative payoff. And that'll lead to this kind of rise and fall cycle. If you have adjacent empires on different cadences, they'll kind of tend to go back and forth as dictated by their underlying resource bases and technology and everything. So you can construct these kind of well-founded geopolitical models. You can do the same thing with some internal kind of political factional analyses. But to require kind of a global or predominant, help me on the pronunciation here, Alex, but Weltanschauung. Weltanschauung, yeah. Frau never did like my pronunciation. That requires kind of a coherence in that population that I don't think ever really existed in America.
Yes. That's one of my biggest takeaways. Saying exactly right. And
you can look at something like the 60s and people think, oh, 60s, hippies, revolution. But people forget that if you polled young person public opinion at the time, there's like 40% of the college age population that wanted to nuke Hanoi.
Yeah.
Yes. And so this is the thing about this sort of psychological basis, is it ends up being fundamentally from the actual real world causal factors, or rather it can be disconnected, because of course the Great Depression is not something you can really escape, so it has a very real effect. But then there's people's optimism being conditioned by propaganda and engineering, and more importantly, I think the myths that we tell ourselves as Americans about our history, and they seem to buy into a lot of these myths. And we'll get into maybe later why it is that this is troubling to the New York Times. But that's just it, is like now you're supposed to be looking towards this glorious new future, and they're disturbed, I guess, that people wouldn't see it that way.
Yeah. I mean, again, as I said very early on, an implicit Whiggism to the whole thing.
Yes.
Like it's fundamentally a cyclical Whiggism. I don't know how else. So
esoteric boomer Yankee historicism.
it could have benefited from, I guess, splicing in, particularly from the millennial seculum from effectively 1946 till now, or till 97 when it was published. There's plenty of like firsthand accounts or more nuanced and tighter windowed history that they could have spliced in to kind of give more on the ground perspectives of people living at those time periods. That's why like Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America, is great, because it is very much an on the ground history. It is, an overview of American history up to that point, but it's also great because it splices in like actual historical facts from people who existed at the time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that in reference to American involvement in the World War II, they seem to describe it in the ways it is described now as some kind of righteous
adventure.
crusade against evil or something.
Yeah, like the GIs who fought it were heroes.
Yeah, that's why they all volunteered, right? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why like American polling at the time indicated almost 80% of the population was adamantly opposed to any war on the European continent.
I mean, neither of these guys are historians, are they? Are they?
Not particularly, no.
Certainly not revisionists of any sort.
Well, these guys remind me of these kind of books that were, I don't know if they still exist, to be honest, because I don't take them as seriously as I used to. But when I was younger, I would find some book that somebody was like giving away at Goodwill, and like literally it was like $1, so I'd have all these weird books. And it reminds me of this guy named Harry Dent. You guys know who that is? He's this guy who wrote this ridiculous book called like Dow 40,000, and he was saying like
very
it also reminds me of the transhumanist crowd almost, or like Michio Kaku, this science writer,
Japanese science man.
Not nearly as prestigious as our native American African science man, but he did the job when they needed somebody to step up to the plate to make mind-blowing graphics of exponential trends.
Megatrends, John Nesbitt. That was another one. That was an 80s one. I kind of put these all in the same category of airport book. It's like, this is like sitting in a terminal for 4 hours during my layover. I better buy something that's grand and sweeping and keeps me from getting bored.
It's like the James Patterson of American history books. It really is, in my mind. So, after World War II, we come to the millennial seculum, which is probably the most interesting because it's the one that impacts our current existence in the year 2017. So right after World War II, and this is a very, very common trend and or theme in the way American history is taught now, is that right after World War II, we had this glorious period from 46 to 64. It was like the 50s was extended, an extra 10 years effectively. And you have huge economic growth because there's no real competitors left on the planet except for the Soviets, who are also suffering tremendously still from World War II. You have
They're at a steep point in the sort of technological growth curve too.
Yeah,
a lot of low hanging fruit to be had by just making up for all the lost, or not lost, but the things that weren't produced in the 30s.
Yeah, just a ton of tractors. Like that was a common thing. Just we built 30,000 tractors this year or something. And then you hit. I mean, the way that the high is described, is particularly in this period, is you have this GI generation coming home and taking the reins from the lost generation, and then also preventing the silent generation from really having much say. And they have a ton of kids, and that's where the baby boom or the boomers come from.
The silent generation didn't have a single U.S. president, did they?
Yeah, the silent generation is effectively like just I don't want to say a non-generation, but they didn't really play much role in the United States in a way that I can understand it.
Yeah, I guess it's like John McCain, someone like that is that's like the most influence they ever had.
Yeah, that would explain a lot. So they come home. They have all these great works projects. There's a lot of civic virtue. There's the Mr. Smith. They cite this. The Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of ethos to them, and they build a lot of the physical infrastructure and societal infrastructure that we have today, and a lot of it hasn't changed remarkably since then. You can say that fits with the model of history that Strauss and Howe are describing, or you could also say that it's just because we've been in a general decline since World War II, and no one has had a real idea on how to make big radical changes the way that the GIs did.
Such as the 1965 Immigration Act.
Yeah, well, we should talk about that. That comes immediately after.
I don't even understand how that even got on the docket. I mean, was that a problem that people were having? We need more people to come in. What the hell?
First of all, what's his name?
I get the behind the scenes stuff, but the people were not calling for this, so it was just dropped in their lap.
We cited specific statistics that showed the vast majority of Americans were very opposed to the Hart-Celler Act, and they were lied to about it, by the way.
Sure.
And at the time, it wasn't even a high saliency issue.
Yeah.
Because it was working so well, it was ironically screw up.
Yeah, society was kind of hard to fuck up at that point. Like everything was great. There's a YouTuber, Granville Thorndike, and he's made a couple of these big compilation videos, and he made one, about Americanism. It was it's about half hour long. It's pretty good.
Well, his most famous one is the future is, or the president is a foreign country.
Yeah, that guy.
About Britain, and it's the same thing for here.
Yes, and it has actual. And that's what this book suffers from: lack of actual interviews with people who lived during that time. And it's essentially all guys are saying it was fantastic.
But interviews are hard work.
Yes, that's true.
It's easier just to sit in your office and type shit,
Yeah, that is true. So, but they have interviews with people at that time. They all from different walks of life, all describing it as just as an actual golden age, and from their point of view.
But see, they actually realize it. I mean, because it's like they're old enough to remember the war and the Depression. But see, the boomers, they knew nothing but this kind of golden age, and so to them it's just normal. And so they don't understand why the millennial generation or the generation right after them, the Gen Xers, are disillusioned.
So, and this, it doesn't. The idea of the boomers having this mindset we'll talk about, not having suffered through the crisis as much personally, fits with the general model, but it's never been at this point where they're just so detached from problems that went on during the Depression and World War II, I guess. The idea that the Germans were going to invade the United States, kind of silly. but
Well,
certainly
the
a
United
lot
States
of people
didn't really
believed that.
suffer physical harm, but the kind of total psychological transformation that the country went through during that time, and the fact that it was a big war, and almost 500,000 people, Americans that is, died, did certainly shock the nation, I think, into realizing that was a very serious time. So I don't think, and plus, forget the Germans for a moment. The Japanese did attack the United States for God knows what reason. In retrospect, that was the biggest mistake they ever made. But yeah.
Well, they were maneuvered into doing so through the embargo
the
of necessary
ABCD
war
sanctions.
materials. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Japanese got, I believe, the majority of their steel from America as well as oil.
I think the main concern for them was the oil.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, once you run out of oil, if you're a naval power, you can't move, you can't fight.
So this consciousness, as we noted, has a lot of parallels with the transcendental awakening. It's this sort of new age spirituality. Part of it is influenced by bad existentialism, and part of it is influenced by total disintegration in American Protestantism and lack of penetration of American Catholicism in the wider population. So there's this huge spiritual gap left in tens and tens of millions of, well-to-do middle class or upper middle class, or sometimes even upper class white Americans living in even living in cities or living on the countryside, who all sort of look for something to grab onto. I guess we should finally talk about the boomers, because this is what I think a lot of people probably tuned into this episode for, and it's something that we all talk about pretty often. What is it about? No, Bannon is Gen X.
Yeah. Okay.
He's got to be a boomer. He's like 60 years old.
No, that could be Gen X at this point.
No.
Well, he was born in 1953.
Oh.
So
he's a boomer.
Yeah. He's a boomer. All right.
It's basically the boomer generation.
All right.
Okay. So
changes everything now. Throw away your
notes. So I was wrong that he's a boomer.
Yeah, he looks like hell. He's old.
He's like taken the president going from how every president grays prematurely through their job, and he's just taken that with some steroids. It's crazy.
Yeah, look at pictures of Bannon from 2010 and fat Wolverine. Look at him now. It's like the horror has seized him.
Yeah, he literally had.
Why people want to go to DC is still beyond me. It's like, what are you getting?
You don't go because you want to. I think in his case, I think he felt that it was necessary. But
he has.
That's a bit of a digression.
He is a boomer, but he has that GI mentality of like, I have to.
Admirable.
I can't.
I'm talking about the sick people who actually just want to do it because they think that's going to help them.
This is a good point on the boomers. Like most boomers, and that they go into this failed at their goals because it was only ever goals. Like the thing that defined the boomers more than anything else was idealistic centralization. That was the main ontology of boomers in their relationship with government. It was not the GI approach of, no, we're actually going to go to Washington and do this and that. We're going to find a way to do it. No matter what happens, we're going to find a way to get that public works project going. We're going to find a way to reorient immigration. Like, even if it's bad in the long run for us, they still found a way to go do it.
How are they centralizers?
The boomers?
Yeah. Because the Nixon, the Ford era, that's still the World War II and the silent generation wearing the pants, really. The boomers are at 1980s and 90s. That's when they're setting policy.
Yeah.
They're the ones who invent the idea of this is going on your permanent record.
I don't know.
That's the way that I like to explain.
I don't think that was the boomers, though. They were told that. I wasn't really
That's
told
an old
that.
trope.
Well, it's an old trope, and it dates back to about the 80s when it became possible to do so, and when
they had records.
It's from. I'm going to say that people were making that joke in the 60s.
Yeah, exactly.
But whatever. I mean, point taken.
Well, what I really mean by that is the sort of enforcement of digitized systems of social control, not just mass media, which had existed before, but a kind of professionalized and extremely weaponized mass media. A lot of the sort of problematic systems of social control that we have now only really date back to the 80s. Like, look at some of the memoirs of people who kind of bummed around in the 60s and 70s from town to town. Like, I guess On the Road was in the 50s, but you can extrapolate it forward where, nobody was quite worried about their reputation per se. There was going to be a job. Right, there was going to be a job waiting for them whenever they got over their phase.
Or
I've been checking their resume.
Down so long it all looks like up to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that so one of the ways that they were, and again, idealistic centralizers is my main point. That's I'm getting that from the authors.
Like Hillary Clinton is a boomer, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
She's also not human.
Yeah,
Most
do
boomers
lizards also have this generational hypothesis? Is that for lizard people as well?
Who?
Well, I mean, boomers are effectively. I mean, they're their own race. I don't get boomers even white.
They're the last generation where there was enough sort of pre-Malthusian cultural inertia left over that they were raised right. Like they're the generation that were still raised by they're probably the last generation raised by their mothers, right? Instead of government schools and
yeah,
but did they make
I
that
agree
point
with that.
They were coddled, but they were coddled excessively. But like the mothership was redefined as this whole industry under the boomer childhood period.
Sure.
I would keep in mind that a lot of boomers were beaten with belts.
Right. I would, for me, when I like the boomer hatred things, but I think the essence of the boomer, as we'll talk about it, is they were really the last generation of people for whom the civic lie was plausible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again, idealistic centralizers of the boomer centralization didn't actually like happen. They were just people who propagated these ideas and then have convinced like Gen X. Like Paul Ryan is Gen X, but Paul Ryan is effectively living in the centralization ideal of the boomers.
Yeah, but he claims Rage Against the Machine is his favorite band.
That's a boomer thing to say.
So cringe when he said that. And the band itself was embarrassed.
Yes, I can imagine Paul Ryan just sitting there cranking "Sleep Now on the Fire" while he rewrites American tax legislation to fuck the average manufacturing worker in Iowa.
Didn't you see
Paul
that
Ryan
publicist
was
approved
installed
photo?
specifically because he agreed to maintain the system of control that had been set up.
Right.
But dude, he works out with an iPod. He's got big guns. Haven't you seen that photo?
That red hat.
Yeah. Backwards.
That Bart Simpson hat.
So we're in this. How do they authors describe the boomers in this generational model?
Let me see. Individualist,
They're prophets.
anti-institutional.
They're prophets.
That's what I have.
Yeah, they're the prophet category.
Yes. And so it fits with the model, like, and I don't know if the model is working backwards, literally from the boomer to Gen X pipeline, but it fits the model that like the boomer decision making is what creates the alienation and cynicism that Gen X is known. Like there's at one point, so they mention that the boomers are particularly, in the American context at least, antinatalist generation.
Well, Gen X was raised by the silent generation.
Gen X was raised by the silent generation, but they were sort of living in the shadow of the boomers, and then the later Gen X took boomer ideals, like from the Ayn Rand period. And that's where the entire Gen X American conservative establishment comes from. Paul Ryan, Eric Erickson, Rick Wilson, all these fucking people.
Here they say, the boomer generation, prophet, born 43 to 60, basked as children in Dr. Spock's permissiveness, suburban conformism, Sputnik Quora schooling, beaver cleaver friendliness. I guess that's leave it to beaver. Father knows best, family order. That's in italics. I guess that's a program or something. I'm not familiar with it. From the summer of love to the days of rage, they came of age rebelling against worldly blueprints of their parents. As their flower child, Black Panther, weathermen, Jesus freak fringes proclaim themselves arbiters of public morals. Youth pathologies worsened, and SAT scores began a 17-year slide. In the early 1980s, many young adults became self-absorbed yuppies with mainstream careers but perfectionist lifestyles. Entering midlife and national power, they are trumpeting values, touting a, quote, politics of meaning, and waging a scorched earth culture wars. Here's this is kind of funny. American, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich, Steven Spielberg, Candace Bergen, Spike Lee, Bill Gates, and then foreign Tony Blair and Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know, man. Get the fuck out with this shit. Like, seriously.
Also, what the fuck? Like, so are they aware that Israeli society differs from American society and has its own generational dynamics?
Yeah,
that's like astonishingly ignorant.
Honestly. That's why I was holding my tongue until the very end, and I just couldn't anymore.
Other than Netanyahu, that was the only Israeli, right?
Well, it's actually Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know if that's different.
That's how you say it. Yeah.
That's Bibi. That's King Bibi. Yeah.
The J sound is very rare in most languages.
Gotcha.
So
one thing I'm a little confused about is this scorched earth culture wars.
What does
I'm not sure what they mean by that. I guess it would be like in the 80s you had, I don't know, the heavy metal Satanism scares and stuff. Like I'm not really seeing
is it like
where
Billy Graham, like fire and brimstone kind of thing.
Like this just doesn't even make sense to me, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's
when people say culture war, they mean something like evil right wingers complaining about some aspect of degeneracy or dispossession.
Did you guys ever see that SNL approved movie CB4 with Chris Rock? There was
no.
Well, okay,
no,
but it's basically it was kind of a parody of NWA. And it was the gangster rap era in the early 90s, and Phil Hartman played this kind of culture warrior, conservative type who was against, like, you know, the use of dirty lyrics and in rap videos and music and all that. So I think that's what they're referring to. It's kind of this, like, maybe even a Rush Limbaugh type
naivete with, like, very American superficial self-generated mythology. Like here's their 13th generation, which, you know, that's Gen X is where it comes from. The X comes from being literally the 13th American generation. So the boomers were the prophets. So 13th generation, Gen X, the nomads, born 1961 to 1981. All right, get this. Survived a hurried childhood of divorce, latchkeys, open classrooms, devil child movies, and a shift from G to R ratings. They came of age curtailing the earlier rise in youth crime and fall in test scores, yet heard themselves denounced as so wild and stupid as to put, in italics, the nation at risk. As young adults maneuvering through a sexual battlescape of AIDS and blighted courtship rituals.
I mean, I
they
don't
date
disagree
and
with
marry
this.
cautiously. In jobs, they embrace risk and prefer free agency over loyal corporatism. From grunge to hip-hop, their splintery culture reveals a hardened edge, Politically, they lean towards pragmatism and non-affiliation and would rather volunteer than vote. Widely criticized as Xers or slackers, they inhabit a italics reality bites. Well, that's a movie I know. Economy of declining young adult living standards. American, Tom Cruise, Jodie Foster, Michael Dell, Deion Sanders, Winona Ryder, Quentin Tarantino. Foreign, Princess D.
Entertainers.
And foreign, Princess D and Atlantis Morissette. Forgive me, I feel like I'm reading a fucking horoscope, man.
Yeah.
I think it was fairly well written. I don't disagree with the kind of characterization.
They were the first generation whose parents didn't have anything useful to teach them.
That's true.
There's just a certain naivete here. It's like,
well,
okay,
what would
let's
you say? How would you describe Gen X? That's what they were doing.
This is fun though. Let's do millennial. Hero in question mark. Okay, born 82 to 87, I guess. Or no,
I think it's 97.
Yeah. Well, it says here 82 to 07. Well, regardless.
Anyway.
First arrived when baby on board signs appeared. As abortion and divorce rates ebbed, the popular culture began stigmatizing hands-off parental styles and recasting babies as special. Child abuse and child safety became hot topics, while books teaching virtues and values became bestsellers. Today, politicians define adult issues from tax cuts to deficits in terms of their effects on children. Hollywood is replacing cinematic child devils with child angels. And cable TV and the internet are cordoning off child-friendly havens. While educators speak of standards and cooperative learning, school uniforms are surging in popularity. With adults viewing children more positively, U.S. test scores are faring better in international comparisons.
Wow.
Wait, here. Let's do the American. Jessica McClure, the Olsen twins, Baby Richard, Elisa Lopez, Dooney Waters, Jessica Dubroff. Foreign. I don't even know who these people are. I know the Olsen twins are.
Jessica Dubroff.
Jesus Christ in heaven. Oh, man.
I still don't think that was worse than the Gen Xers. The Gen Xers one I thought was accurate, but I mean, it's not all wrong. I think it's easy to find little problems and just laugh. But okay, I'm going to ask you guys describe our fucked up generation. I mean, there's some weirdness going on here, and I think
it's the first generation raised on pornography, hardcore pornography.
I guess. I had a passage I liked. If I can take a turn reading, it's not too long. I guess this is us, but it sounds like it could apply to Gen X too. Okay, so whatever 30 to 40-ish people do will be criticized by elders, not just for failing to meet the prior standard, but also for being a bad influence on children. This generation will personify what America will dislike about the widening gap between haves and have-nots. Its failures will be perceived as deserved, its successes less so. High-flying youths will be condemned as economic predators and appropriate targets of luxury taxation, while low-lifers will be assailed as incorrigible and unworthy of public aid. By the end of the Unraveling, the American social category with the greatest reputation for virtue will be the ones that which relatively few young adults will belong, the middle class. And that last part is pretty accurate.
That's more accurate than the passage Nick read, and there's like a schizophrenia there, because that passage is almost in total contradiction with the passage that Nick read, and they're both describing the same group of people. And this is like where the book goes off. For me, there's this part of the book. It tries to pin down what's wrong with Gen X and what's wrong with millennials is not accurate. And it's not great. Prior to that, it's a good complementary tool. Albion Seed, some other stuff. And then the predictions at the end for how things will turn out are neat, just to see how someone in 97 tried to predict how things were going to turn out for us by 20 years later. And some of them are actually pretty accurate. So that part's kind of interesting to read. But this part of the book is just, I don't know. It's very boomer theory. It's all of like the schizophrenic boomer complaints of millennials. Like millennials are either too hardcore at work, millennials don't work at all. I don't get it.
Again, esoteric Yankee boomer historicism is how I would describe this book. But
I mean, the salient feature of the millennial generation is the fertility rate for women in their 20s. It's just, especially if you control for race, has just collapsed compared with Gen X.
Without immigration, like we would have probably negative births or negative population.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but last time I went to my nearest national park, I did not want more and more people. So it's really just the business people that want, rising stock market all the time. And I guess, Japan has to deal with this in its own way. But, I mean, honestly, it's like they have a pretty nice country. And I don't think we need more people putting, more pressure on the water system, the environment. I would enjoy having a little more space. That's what this country was originally like.
Right.
Well,
do you realize though that a weak fertility rate? I mean, all right, maybe we'll put aside the environmental.
No, of course, I don't want us to disappear. All I'm saying is, I don't want the immigration. I don't necessarily think we have to have a growing population. It'd be nice if it was somewhat stable, but anyway.
We could agree to disagree on that, but it's an index of social pathology. Like if an organism cannot reproduce itself, 2.1 children per woman, then something is going wrong.
Right.
Yeah. But you could also have just too many people too, putting too much pressure on the system. So maybe it's better to have a few.
But I mean, people
period of drawing down the population. But like I said, I don't want
human
to
beings we're reproduction machines. Like someone was saying recently.
Yeah, but we also like to eat.
Can I finish, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, but people. In 1920, people making $8,000 a year in today's money would have 11 kids. Like that wasn't unheard of.
Right.
And it's, for whatever reason, the signals are mixed now, and we're not doing what we're programmed to do. That's all.
I guess. No, I hear you, but what I'm trying to say is that the program is kind of been hijacked by circumstance, and that we have so much surplus, and the population of the world is just getting out of hand. I mean, it's like projected to be 10 billion at some point. And so, our kind of biology is geared to much more ancient circumstances where there wasn't hyper efficient agriculture stimulated by fertilizers manufactured by a petroleum industry that is trillions of dollars every year. That just didn't exist thousands of years ago. And so we were evolved for very resource scarce environments. And now that we don't have that, we just have a bunch of fat people. And that's what I was just going to say. It's like, well, we also want to eat because we have this sort of instinct that is selected for historically, because when you did have a lack of food, but suddenly there was a bunch, you should gorge so that you build up fat reserves. But when there's a constant supply of surplus food, it doesn't work. It's going haywire. And so I'm saying, yeah, I care about, my people, but I don't necessarily think that we can just blindly just do what our body, wants us to do.
If you guys are don't mind, I think a good place to summarize and close is on the unless you had some other big section you want to get into.
Well, we should talk about the predictions for the just briefly.
Yeah, do that, and then because the thing I would like to close on is the reaction of the system media, New York Times, etc., reacting to Bannon and to this book. And they almost have this obsession with the idea that like a Republican or conservative or whatever you want to call them would have even a hint of intellectualism about them. This like seems to freak them out.
Yeah. So the theory is that the final fourth turning, or the final fourth turning, will be occurring sometime around, like it'll start in 2005, this period, and it'll go till roughly 2025. Again, this was written in 97. So I would amend their model after the fact and say that really the fourth turning began with 9/11. Is that safe to say? That was like
it did for me.
There are specific
so
catalytic events.
Well, without accepting their model, it's unquestionable that 9/11 was the great first crisis of the 21st century in the American context.
Yeah, I don't know that it really changed life on the ground all that much in the U.S., but I guess it changed our geopolitical
I think it did
strategy.
gradually. It changed with the purpose of what
The TSA and all that.
I mean, I used to be proud of this country. I haven't been able to feel that way in a long time. And it really started after 9/11.
So let's get into this because, and it's funny because they actually, one of the scenarios they propose for this catalytic event is terrorists, although they don't say Islamic because again they don't want to offend anyone. Terrorists blow up an airliner and then threaten the United States with nuclear weapons.
What if they didn't do this? Would we still have the crisis period? I wonder. Like, what if you just didn't have anyone to kick off your fourth turning?
I mean, in their minds, so they propose several scenarios. Also, they propose Russian meddling in former Soviet states, and that the Americans would be drawn into a response.
How
and
dare
again,
they?
Yeah, but again, they're kind of on the mark because that happened in 2008, 2007, 2008 with the Georgians.
When Georgia invaded South Ossetia?
Yeah, I guess. And then the Ukrainian crisis. And then there's some other scenarios, like there's one scenario where there's tax revolts, and that kind of predicts the Tea Party, although those people were essentially just sort of goons for Koch
I remember
brothers.
that. That's when all those Republicans grabbed guns and attempted a violent overthrow of D.C., right?
Right, yeah.
Now, my image of that is basically a guy holding
Grover-
his kid in dad jeans on the mall in Washington, holding a crappy protester sign that he put together in the car right over while his wife was driving. I mean, it's sort of sad. I don't want to knock these people. I basically agree with a lot of what they stood for, but the way they went about it was extremely system approved, in that they were just so powerless to actually affect any change. And people say, well, they got some people voted in, but I don't know. It wasn't a very big movement.
Well,
most of those people are gone now.
Yeah.
And produced the extremist groups like the Reagan Commandos for Tax Justice.
Wow. There's a special place in my heart for that. When I tell my grandkids about the Great War or whatever that meme is, it's like I fought in the Great Reagan Tax Cut Commando or something. It's just so stupid.
The Grover Norquist commandos for capital gains tax reduction.
Yeah, that's
whatever.
it. The alternative minimum tax must go.
Yeah, so they were there, and I mean, you can still say that might happen. They predict, and this is one of their also distress points, that like later on, as the crisis hits its critical mass, one of the major distresses will still be this issue of tax revolts, effectively, and threats of secession, which is the inverse of what we're seeing now, because now we're seeing like high tax progressives calling for secession, or the West Coast to secede from the Trump's America or whatever. But anyways, this they'd be like Ted Kaczynski types. It'd be a Unabomber style revolt.
Yeah, does he talk about kind of like the anarchist?
I don't think Kaczynski's really brought up at all.
Yeah,
from what I remember.
He does talk about McVeigh.
Yeah,
Kaczynski is probably far too serious for them.
Yes, right. McVeigh is better like fodder material. About like the average boomer does not want to read about Ted Kaczynski, because it shatters in their mind. Like we talked about this, there's this idea that the only eco-terrorist is a left-wing one.
Well, there's this. I mean, you kind of see this in it focus on things like a tax revolt, because they're looking at it through that civic lens again.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
When the obvious prediction, I mean, it should any form of secession or balkanization is obviously going to occur on racial lines.
Yeah.
not on tax lines. I mean,
the most likely civil unrest scenario going forward is ethnic civil unrest, and then that's never commented on, never once. Like they note that one of the driving forces, the three major driving forces of the culture wars in the early 90s was racial politics and identity politics, but it's never proposed as either a catalytic moment or a distress point throughout the crisis, is like racial tension.
well, and this feeds into the Bannon stuff, because if Bannon's goal is to prevent the breakup of the American empire that would occur for these economic reasons or something, that it's hence his economic nationalism as the anecdote to this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, his. Let's talk about Bannon if we could.
Let's talk about Bannon. I'd like to talk about Bannon through the lens first of the New York Times, because
God, I mean, he's
obsession.
portrayed as this sort of leading figure, and I never even really read Breitbart very much, and it was like, who reads this? I guess people read it, but it's.
I think that the New York Times and the establishment,
I know they need a villain, and I guess he fit the bill.
They're the source of this Bannon meme.
I know.
I mean, it is. It's more popular than the Washington Post. I believe I saw that headline.
Well, I believe it.
Monthly
But
visits. Yeah.
Well, here they say, okay, this is an article titled, like, very, very clear title. Bannon's views can be traced to a book that warns, quote, winter is coming. And I don't think they're referring to Game of Thrones. If I read a little further.
They probably are
yes,
for their audience.
It's the book we're talking about.
97, though. I don't.
Stephen K. Bannon has read the book 3 times. He still keeps a copy of it, one that is creased and copiously underlined, in a library with the rest of his favorites at his father's house, and blah, blah, blah. They go on to give a little bit of that, but here they say about Bannon, the basis of his worldview, which has been described as everything from Leninist to alt-right, an extremist fringe movement associated with white nationalism, is still shrouded in mystery and conjecture. But by his own telling, much of the foundation for his political beliefs can be found in the book, which predicts that America is hurling towards a crisis on par with the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the Great Depression. And the grim, dark future of the book foresees to help explain the underpinnings of the president's conservative... I added grim, dark. It's grim future. President's conservative... yeah, that's for you, Hank. Conservative nationalist America First agenda. One that Bannon has played a large role in shaping. And
so that was New York Times. And sorry, that's not from the book. That's from them. And when was that published, though?
This was published April
earlier this year,
2017.
This year, okay. So after Trump gets in, so they're still hammering on this Bannon. Now, was he out of the administration? I think he was still there, right? So they still had a reason to.
Well, I should add, so your average New York Times consuming rube, like, actually believes that Bannon is a white nationalist, Frank.
Yeah. They know they do.
And they've done so much to create him up as this, like, and they've even, I think it was the Darth Vader, was that Cheney or Rumsfeld?
Yeah, that was Cheney.
But it's a similar kind of thing. They're like, they making him out to be this, like, mysterious, like, mystic villain or some kind, like.
It is weird to talk to shitlib, like, normie type people. They're just obsessed with Bannon. They like want
no,
to, or at
no.
least
They really think
ago.
This stuff is actually what I guess their enemy is actually,
because their entire worldview, like, this is why they use phrases like "winter is coming." Their entire worldview is completely informed by these cinematic narrative portrayals where there has to be some dark mastermind behind the scenes with some hidden agenda, but a secret key that unlocks that agenda and allows the viewer to understand what he's really about. The notion that you can have somebody who's sort of just acting as the avatar for historical forces, or somebody who's just coordinating things that kind of metaphysically want to happen, that's not something that comports with the fundamental way that they see events as happening.
Well, and
why is that, Hank? Is that due to their I don't know, like, emotional retardation? Like,
yeah, I mean,
it's that Harry Potter, right?
Yeah,
that sums
could
it up.
ascribe it. the sort of corporatization of media. I don't know that it's like corporate per se, but the emergence of these commercial narratives and their complete domination of most of the ways that people consume media.
I would describe it as this: if you're a average Brooklynite or San Franciscanite or LA or whatever, Seattle, these globalist shitlib cities, and just look at the voting records. I mean, these are where people are voting for Bernie or Hillary. Nobody will even admit to voting for Trump if they did. And it's like you are part of, to use the NRX term, cathedral. You are part of the system, and they look through the lens of their university, their social circle, and these stupid cafes or whatever they're hanging out in, and the New York Times, and they think that's reality. Now, meanwhile, they have no concept of the middle part of the country where they make stuff and they grow stuff and they live, close to physics and chemistry rather than sociology and this nonsense that is all completely fake. But if you live in a city, you're removed from all that. And I think they get their sort of worldview from Netflix. And they think like everything works like that. And it's just they have no concept of how
I'm going to have
things
to
work.
disagree a little bit. So I'll give you I would look at it like this. It's a product of the liberal totalitarian worldview, where they are actually legitimately concerned of a coherent ideological threat. And I would say that the liberals, the so to speak, the left or whatever, the people you described, the city, the urbanite cosmopolitans,
useful idiots.
Yeah, these people, I would actually say they are more intellectually sophisticated than their opponents have been. And so they are genuinely afraid of a legitimate intellectual or ideological challenge.
Sure, I would agree.
I think that's where the fear comes from. And so that's why they're scouring like hints.
I think the smarter ones are more insecure in that. But I think if you listen to the clips, the Fast the Nation one that came out, it was basically doing a good job at just playing all these people who are these talking heads.
Yeah, but those aren't the system's actual intellectuals. Those are just.
No, I know. That's my point, and that's I think the majority of people.
Yeah,
though,
but there is no similar cast. Yeah, it's a majority for sure, but there is no similar cast on the right of like. And you all know I'm not a fan of the left-right breakdowns, but just shorthand, like on the right that there's no similar cast of like ideological vanguard of intellect, because all the right is a watered-down liberalism that's dragging its heels at the ultimate conclusion. The conservative is entirely posturing. There is no independent, coherent ideological threat. And so what worries them about someone like Bannon is he actually is a system figure. This is a guy who was in naval intelligence and worked at Goldman Sachs and has the ear of, or had, or what, who knows, has this relationship with the man who is now president. This actually
who they also hate and also has something approaching a dangerous ideology.
Right, exactly. And they're worried that there actually is a plan. They're worried that there is a coherent ideological plan behind all of this, and that Bannon has some kind of secret army of neo-Nazis and white nationalists ready to storm the New York Times building and throw these fuckers out of their windows.
I think you're talking about people who are actually pretty. Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but yeah, no, I get what your point is. But I was describing your average city, shitlib person who listens to NPR and is just
and you're totally right on that.
I mean. You're talking about the people who are actually trying to run this shit.
Talking about the people who are legitimately sophisticated.
Yeah, sure.
The people who work for the oligarchy.
Yeah, who actually, and I think there's a tendency...
Consciously work for the oligarchy is what I would add, because I think a lot of people work for the oligarchy and they have no clue.
We all do, yeah.
Yeah, basically.
Paying taxes, some of us.
My goal in life is to try to just like not exist to the government. It's like, who is this man? Like, there's this photo in Bill Gates's yearbook, and like, he was not exactly the ladies' man, and it's just him like laying on a desk talking to a phone, a rotary phone, wearing one of these like Sam Hyde skull caps, and the caption reads, "Who is this man?" I don't know if that's exactly what I want to do, but with regard to the government, that's my goal.
I got a great bridge you can live under.
Okay, but I won't buy it.
Let me. So here they say, But those who question Mr. Trump and Mr. Bannon's motives say the central premise of the fourth turning, with its religious subtext and dark premonitions, is a convenient excuse to sow fear and justify extreme action. Many academic historians dismiss the book as about as scientific as astrology or a Nostradamus text, which ironically it seems a lot of us seem to agree with. And many will find reason for alarm in its conclusion that the coming crisis will demand loyalty and conformity from citizens. I mean, there's something very like snakish about all this, because these are the same people who are the ones who are demanding civic loyalty.
Well, they seem to think that there's going to be a repeat of World War II or something. That's what I hear when they say there needs to be a coming together to confront some crisis. Well, I mean, there's no way that's going to happen in this country.
I think it's the shadow in the back of their minds, like because they when they say things, it's this ultimate case of projection. When they say things like justify extreme action, I mean, they're the extremists, and that's their whole game. Is they take the most insane and extreme positions and sell it as normal and inevitable. And
they're chemically castrating little boys in non-trivial numbers now.
Yeah, and to oppose this is extreme, and they know it's what happens if you're a criminal and you're doing vile and evil shit to people. Then there's a part of your mind, because you're not a stupid criminal. You know that someone's supposed to react to it. Somebody's supposed to do something about you, and they fear it. That's what they fear. They expect it, but it never arrives. And so when there's even a hint of it, when there's even a hint that someone is possibly a contender, then they actually kick into high gear, and they take this seriously, and they're going through and investigating like everything Bannon has ever said and trying to find like the intellectual lineage to it.
Well, apparently there's like an alt-right desk or something at the New York Times, which is just kind of, okay, well, where were you 3 years ago? But it's like, okay, your institution is caught up, and now everybody thinks the alt-right is boring, and so, well, there you go. But like, why would you even read this newspaper anymore? But you're right. I mean, like they're putting money into this stuff now.
I think that they're scared of it. I mean, the religious aspect. I don't get that at all from it. But they're scared because it effectively means like the end of history, right? This essentially says that Fukuyama and the end of history project that the liberals had is stupid. And then in fact, this is cyclical, that there's always this period in time where you have decadence and people thinking that they've hit the ideal system, and then history comes back. And right. one of the things about the crisis too high pipeline is like the consolidation of strong autocratic figures, which is essentially what they fear more than anything. And I know Alex wanted to bring this up, like the great man theory, like the idea of a strong autocratic figure is like, I mean, to use a pop culture phrase that they would always use, it's kryptonite to these people. They hate it.
Yeah. So this is probably maybe a good moment to throw in my last objection. So sure, we're in a crisis period now. I wouldn't dispute that as an appropriate label for what's going on. But so that would basically guarantee that the next stage has to be a high. And to my thinking, I mean, we could have a high by the 2030s if, like, we get one of these great men of history, or things just kind of shake out and we're able to reboot America. But we could very likely, maybe this is the most likely outcome, just sort of continue our slump into modernity as we approach a sort of idiocracy. So you have these two radically different possibilities. And you can go back in history and play this game like, what would have happened if this battle was won or that battle was won? Like, there's many cases where a single battle would have radically changed history. Like, what if, Genghis Khan had drowned in a river as a boy or something? So, I mean, what do you make of that? Like, would you guys think that the 2030s are looking like a high in quotation marks?
Well,
isn't that when Emperor Baron Trump's reign begins?
God, kill yourself.
I never got that at all. I'm like, why do we want this dynasty of these people? I mean, the father is obviously somewhat competent, but like, come on, like we're gonna have Ivanka running things, and this is so stupid.
It's
No, but we could
obviously
have
just a meme.
I remember talking to some guys from NRX, and they were saying that like they had some people approach who weren't like in their circles or whatever, just people they knew, colleagues or what have you, approach them and ask them like take them aside into the corner, like talking by the coat sleeve, like so you believe in cultural decline? And when they told me, I was just shocked, because I guess I'm in my own little bubble where it's like, of all the things going on, there's nothing more self-evident in reality right now than cultural decay. I mean, you don't need to look far for that. I mean, all you need is a sense of history. And that's the thing that these people are seemingly hell-bent on preempting, is the idea that there is like a natural stopgap to what they're doing, that nature will in fact assert itself. I mean, I guess that's what we're all hoping for too. I mean, as Alex was saying, they're pumping up little kids with chemicals and castrating
I think
them.
everybody's just fighting for that pension, and they don't want to lose their boat. I mean, it's pathetic. People are just clinging on to these stupid things.
Bring it up. Bring the chemical castration up, or bring the sort of various critiques of the homosexual movement up to normal people, like older people, and say, "Hey, Dad, do you remember in the '80s when you called them perverts, not gays?" And they won't even talk about it. They just shut off.
No,
it's
that
like
never happened.
It's like LaFond was saying in his recent podcast. Like most people would rather get beaten up once every decade than have to be aware of an unpleasant fact every day.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I see what the ruling elite are doing, or in their media organs. I see a lot of it as a giant shit test that we've been failing.
Uh-huh.
It's like, are you going to stop us? Are you going to stop us? And
there's a great poll meme.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there's a great poll meme where it's like, Pepe the Frog dressed up as a member of the SS, and he has like a bunch of SJW types with purple hair and problem glasses against a wall, and he's basically frowning and saying, "Why did you make me do this?" Just something like that. That effectively, like, that it is a big shit test, and eventually they're waiting to see if Bannon and his army of white nationalists is actually going to burn down the New York Times. I think that they want us to do it or something.
That's what I'm saying, man. I think that because it's just something deep inside them is like, how the fuck are they letting us get away with this? And so they have to assume that like even the slightest challenge, even the slightest hint of a person in an actual position of some measure of power, be it Bannon or the Stephen Miller, like these people, they endlessly speculate. It's like, okay, we got to go through their entire life to see like when it is they have that secret meeting with David Duke. It's like I think they believe this stuff. I think that they believe that Bannon poses an ideological threat to them.
Well, I think they're somewhat clueless. I think they're somewhat clueless in that they're so out of touch with normal people's pressures of their own lives. I mean, if you've got... I sent you guys a link from Sean Parker, and he's talking about his, we billionaires are a special class. And if you think we're ever, going to let go of that, you got news coming to you. But, we're the type of people that are going to get life extension, and we're going to live to 160. And just imagine, what, if you think we've got power now, when you take the principle of compound interest and you push it out to 160, think of how much power we're going to have then. And he's just so self-aware of how obnoxious this statement is. And there's like a comment, which of course I would never personally endorse, but the comment that caught my eye, at least on the YouTube video, was, let's see how good his billions protect him from a 2-2-3 round. He's going to have to stack those pretty thick. And this is exactly what happened during the French Revolution, where people were just so let them eat cake, and we saw what happened.
Well, I mean, and the flip side of that, how I would prefer to frame it would be they're out of touch with how complete their victory has been. Because they don't know what to do with it, with all that they've won. Because first of all, they have no real vision for what they want. they just, I mean,
Right,
all these
just
people
make
know
things
is to
worse.
destroy.
Hedonism, life extension. It's just more me.
Well, they're the
me,
forces
me.
of death. They're the forces of their anti-life in every respect. And so there is nothing, now that they've won, there's nothing that they can do except destroy more, and they're running out of things to ruin.
Yeah, I was going to object and say that, well, maybe Bannon does pose a short-term threat to them or medium-term threat, but even he is sort of stuck in their paradigm. Like,
Right,
there's
that's
only
my
so
point.
much he can say.
Right. He's
Well, he wants his son to graduate from Harvard or wherever he sent him, and he can't, mess that up for him, and so he's got to go get the good job at the good law firm or whatever he's, studying, and it's everybody's trapped in this system.
I see no evidence that Steve Bannon isn't actually a liberal.
Well, he is literally a liberal in like the high-level sense, right?
That's what I mean when I use it. Yeah, I mean, I've seen no evidence, and I sure as hell see a lot of people writing in whatever they want to believe he is. He's not your Caesar, folks.
See